Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. I have with me philosopher and logician Jc Beall. JC, welcome.
Thank you.
So before we get started, can you just tell me a little bit about who you are and just sort of generally about some of your work?
Well, as you said, I'm Jc Beall. I've worked mainly in logic, particularly philosophical logic, that is formal logic in the service of philosophy, and in particular mainly non-classical logic and especially so-called subclassical logic. These are logics weaker than classical logic, though other things too. And I've worked a lot in the philosophy of logic, including people put truth theory into that, and truth theory can really be split into a sort of a nature question, including no nature in some sense, and a logic question, which is like formal theories of truth and paradox. So that's why it sometimes gets lumped into philosophy of logic. Anyway, so that's where I'm mainly coming from is the sort of logic, philosophy of logic side of things.
Remind me, you wrote a book about truth, no?
I wrote a book called Spandrels of Truth, and this advances a glut theoretic. Graham Priest and Richard Routley like to call it dialethic, but sort of glut theoretic versus gap theoretic account of transparent truth, which is truth is simply a sort of see-through predicate, an entirely transparent device brought in for standard expressive or generalization purposes as deflationist, and in particular, sort of certain brands of disquotationalists have long said. And in that book, even though the first paper I wrote in this direction was called Transparent Disquotationalism, and it was a sort of gappy, glutty account of language and logic, and it said that the reason we get gluts in the language is that we try to characterize gaps. Truth is merely transparent, but we bring in these gap-closing devices, and that gives us true contradictions or gluts. But when I got to writing that book, Spandrels of Truth, it turned out that, as I looked closer, it turned out that while there are certainly models of that sort of philosophical picture, they one and all boil down to what are called LP models. LP is a logic made famous by Graham Priest, first advanced by Florencio Asenjo. And so I wound up just going a glutty, just an LP-based account in that book. But yeah, that was, and I'm doing a sort of follow-up to that right now. I'll be finishing. Working title is Undetached, Logic from a Subclassical Point of View, and I think I just sort of keep the original gappy glutty picture and simplify things. But that's yeah. So that's sort of that's an important area in my work. And yeah, I wrote that book, and I'm doing another book related to that now that I'll be finishing up here in the next month or two.
Cool. Let me just say a couple of things for people who may not be familiar with some of the terminology. So when you say gappy and glutty, we're talking about truth values. So a gappy theory is a theory in which you can have propositions propositions where they are neither true nor false. There's a truth value gap, and gluts being where you can have both of them.
That's right.
So just to sort of clarify for anybody who's not familiar with that. Cool. So let's get on to the topic that we were going to discuss today, which is applying some of these logical ideas to issues in Christianity. So can you first sort of introduce for me this general problem? Like, what are the problems in Christianity that you've been applying some of this work to? And then we'll kind of get into the logic.
Yeah. So I do think it's important to talk a little bit about the background logical picture, but I'll go in the direction you want. Let's just stipulate that when we talk about sort of traditional Christian theology, just for ease of conversation, let's stipulate that we're talking about what's sometimes called Chalcedon constrained theology. And this is, Chalcedon was a council that, in the midst of all these heresies, and you can think of heresies as sort of non-standard interpretations of the theory, in the midst of all this, they wanted to sort of lay down what the standard interpretation should be, what the official account is to be. Of course, any account is open to many more interpretations. That's part of the issue, part of the problem. So there was this Council of Chalcedon, and that's generally taken to constrain a very standard sort of Christian theory or theology. And in that, you have some pretty remarkable claims. So one thing that they wanted to be clear about is this Christ figure, whatever plays the Christ role in this theory, is to be exactly one person and have exactly two natures. And it's not that there's sort of hybrid natures. So that was a sort of one heresy or something. And it's not that and the natures are divine nature and human nature. And it's not that the divine nature is just sort of less than, God's nature. It's just God's nature, done. And also the human nature. It's not like it's a superhuman nature that we don't have or something. It's exactly the nature that humans have. So one person, these two natures. And anyway, so it's laid down that that this Christ figure is divine and the Christ figure is human. And Peter Van Imwagen, a philosopher at Notre Dame, coined the term the fundamental philosophical problem, now often just abbreviated as the fundamental problem with this theory. And I'll paraphrase a bit, but his point was that the theory is absurd. Which is a much stronger claim than saying it's not plausible. It's just absurd. Why is it absurd? Well, and we could I'll just sort of write this down, okay, very quickly. Mm-hmm. One, we've got that Christ is divine. Two, Christ is human. I'll show you this in a minute. These are sort of given, okay? So these are sort of axioms, you might say. Three, because Christ is divine, Christ is immutable. And as a matter of fact, this is given as well. So I'll treat that as an axiom. Moreover, Christ is mutable. This is explicit in the council.
Can you say a bit about what immutable and mutable mean?
Think of it as, for our purposes, think of it as cannot be changed. Okay, so down here is where Van den Wagen's problem takes off. There's debate as to whether these are supposed to be entailed by these. So being divine is supposed to, you're unchanging, and being human, you can be changed, or Van den Wagen's own view, which I don't know well, I'm not an expert on that, but I think he wants to say, sure, the standard view, this does entail that, and this does entail that, but his view is, change the view of this and break that entailment or something. But I'm not here to talk about that because I don't know it that well. But so this is pretty much axiomatic in what we're calling standard Christian thought, okay?
Yeah, and let me just say, because
Sure.
there will be some people who are listening just on audio without video. So that was just a list of 4 sort of given axioms here. 1 being Christ is divine, 2 Christ is human, 3 Christ is immutable, and 4 Christ is mutable. And when you were talking about entailments between them, the idea is that Christ being immutable follows from Christ being divine. Christ being mutable follows from Christ being human. So whether you take 3 and 4 to be given or not, they seem to follow from 1 and 2.
That's right. But importantly, this standard view, if you take the council to be sort of, whatever's there as sort of axiomatic in the theory, then we could have just started with Christ is immutable as an axiom. Christ is mutable. Okay. Now, Van den Wagen's claim is that the whole theory is absurd. So what's the argument? So you derive another consequence, namely item 5, which is that Christ is not mutable, or think of this as just another way of saying it's false that Christ is mutable. And this derives from item 3, which is that Christ is immutable. So there's a background entailment between X is immutable. It entails it's false that X is mutable, or X is immutable. It entails that X is not mutable. Okay. Now that alone is a contradiction so then logic tells you that Christ is mutable and not. That's logic. Okay, logic from 6. Okay. So remember, the big question, you asked me, what are some of the problems, right? Van den Wagen coins the fundamental problem with Christian theory is that it's absurd. What's the argument? The argument is, as we said, it follows from the theory that Christ is mutable and immutable. it follows from Christ being immutable that Christ is not mutable. It follows from Christ is not mutable and Christ is mutable. It follows by logic that Christ is both mutable and not. That's logic. And that's just a rule or logical step called adjunction. From P together with Q, you get P and Q. And then you have, from that contradiction, logic tells you that Christ is, Christ is a philosopher in New York City in 2018, right now, as we speak. If that's not absurd enough for you, pick anything you want. Logic tells you that anything you want, your worst nightmare, has got to be true, given the truth of Christ is mutable and not. That's the argument for the fundamental problem of standard Christian theory.
So let me stop you for a moment, because now, since you've run through that argument, for some people who are not familiar with the logic, that last step will seem very mysterious. Why did it make sense that all of a sudden you just proved some arbitrary thing? So I feel like we should say something about like explosion and the sort of controversy there.
So let's so are most people not seeing the video, or should I actually write some of this down?
I think the writing it down does help.
Okay. So the standard in standard logic, which we're taking to be logic at the moment, so-called classical logic, even though it doesn't have a whole lot to do with the classical logic of Aristotle. Standard logic tells you, and this is an argument from C.I. Lewis. It's useful. So given any sentence P or any proposition P, logic tells you that entails, that is, logically entails P or Q. That's called addition. Okay? So that's important. That's addition. Now, let's suppose that we have a glut. We have a contradiction. So we're just going to assume P and not P. Mm-hmm. Okay? It's true that P and it's false that P. All right? We're going to assume that. Now, logic also tells you that from... I should have wrote this down. This is called simplification. Okay, so before we do the Lewis argument, we've got logic tells you that simplification, I've abbreviated that here. Logic tells you from a conjunction, it's true that P and it's true that Q, it follows, according to logic, that it's true that P. And likewise, it's true that Q. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's called simplification. And like we said, addition is the sort of other direction in some sense. If it's true that P, then either it's true that Q or it's true that P. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Those are two standard validities according to classical logic. All right. So now let's assume we've got a glut. It's true to P and it's false to P. Okay? All right. Then by simplification, right, we're going to get P, right? Simplification tells us if we got a conjunction, you get both conjuncts. So we get from 1, we get P and we get Q. And this is 1 and 2, by 1 and 2. Oh, sorry, they're both by 1. Okay, so from that conjunction, we get that conjunct, and we get, whoops, what am I doing? And we get, sorry, it's too early in the morning. From that conjunction, we get that conjunct, and we get that conjunct from simplification.
Yeah, so you can keep it up there for just 1 second.
Yeah.
So we're starting from the assumption, one, that we have a contradiction, P and not P. From what you described as simplification, we get both that P and also that not P, because both of those were in the original conjunction. So they follow by simplification. Continue.
That's exactly right. And this is all according to logic alone. All right. Now, notice what addition tells you, which is sanctioned by logic. It tells you if you've got P, then you get P or Q for any Q you want, right? Mm-hmm. So, well, we've got P. So let's get P or Q first for any Q we want. And that's from 2, and that's addition. I should have bracketed this. This is 2 simp and 1. All right. So addition tells us if you got P, you can get P or Q. We got P, so we're getting P or Q from item 2P and addition. Now, one final rule that logic tells you is valid is what's called disjunctive syllogism. So this tells you, and we'll call this DS, for disjunctive syllogism. Logic, according to the standard account of logic, a disjunction of P and Q, if you've got it that either it's true that P or it's true that Q, and you've got it that it's false that P, logic tells you then it's true that Q. That follows. And that's by what's called disjunctive syllogism. So now applying disjunctive syllogism to what we have here, namely we've got either it's true that P or it's true that Q, we've got it's false that P, we can derive Q. Mm-hmm. And that's by 3, 4 disjunctive syllogism. So this is the C.I. Lewis argument. From an arbitrary contradiction, logic, by only logical steps, we get every sentence we want. Remember, because Q is completely arbitrary.
Right. Q is what is what you had earlier called Jesus is a philosopher in New York City in 2018, or anything like that. Any
That's
kind of
exactly
claim
right.
You can make.
That's exactly right. So from a contradiction, namely from a contradiction, you can derive anything. We skipped all this stuff in the Jesus case, but you get that. Okay.
Right. So again, just to summarize for anybody who's not sort of watching, we had P or Q simply from the fact that we had P, and then disjunctive syllogism tells us if we have P or Q and we have not P, that allows us to derive Q, whatever Q is, and so that's how we have that. Now, it seems that the disjunctive syllogism only makes sense to have as a rule if we're assuming that we're not allowing gluts, right? I mean, it's sort of like the sense behind why that would be a rule would seem to not apply if you are allowing gluts, no?
You have a beautiful mind. You're exactly right. So in order to motivate disjunctive syllogism, okay, I'll speak we'll keep things just simple and so forth, but I think you're exactly right. To motivate disjunctive syllogism, you really you have to rule out the logical possibility of gluts. And notice dually to sort of motivate. This isn't exact dual, but to motivate something like excluded middle, right? Which says every sentence is such that either it's true or it's false, you have to rule out the logical possibility of gaps. So now we're not talking about gaps at the moment, but disjunctive syllogism really should be rejected, as you said, if we recognize the logical possibility of gluts. Okay. So I'll just, because you asked me straight off, what are some of the problems in the Christian theory, the sort of standard theory, and Van and Wagons is a really nice one. So there have been, ever since Aquinas, there have been lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of ways to get around this apparent contradiction. Recently, there was a whole monograph written by a philosopher called Tim Paul, Pawl. He's at University of Thomas Aquinas, I think. It's in Minnesota. Sorry, I might be blanking. But anyway, he wrote a very recent book that summarizes the fundamental problem and goes through a bunch of ways around getting around this contradiction. There's Aquinas's way, which sort of says, well, we should reject these, Christ is immutable, Christ is mutable. Well, we should accept them, but we should understand that what they really mean is Christ is immutable qua divine. Christ is mutable qua human. So this is, so the idea there is something like, these aren't true as they stand, but rather there's a more complicated predicate, mutable qua divine, which is true. But of course, if you add those two more complicated predicates, one says immutable qua divine, the other truth is supposed to be mutable qua human, then you don't get a contradiction. Mm-hmm. So that's been around for a while. Paul's own account is to say that we're the truth or satisfaction conditions for immutability and mutability are more complicated than we normally think. And in particular, the step from immutable to not mutable, or X is immutable, it's false that X is mutable, that fails if you have the right truth conditions. I think that all of this stuff is worth exploring, but it seems to me that it's all heavily constrained by a far too narrow view of logic. And, they're just assuming that logic is the first cab off the block. It's the one that, everyone knows because it was the first one to be formulated. And I think if people working in this area had a better account of logical consequence, I think that would open up many new possibilities for the theological theory in question. And so that's one thing that I've been exploring. There's also, with respect to standard Christian theory, all this stuff about the Trinity, right? That's another big thing. God is supposed to be three persons, but one God. And, so the Father is God. Jesus is God, but Jesus is not the Father. So it looks like, many people say the Trinity is just nonsense, or it doesn't make sense, or whatever. To me, I think that this is a sort of completely naive response. After all, the Trinity is a thesis about identity with respect to the phenomenon at the center of the theory. Every theorist has to give an account of the identity relation that holds for the theory they're advancing. Clearly, the identity relation for this Christian theory is not going to be a standard one. It's probably going to be non-transitive, by which I mean if A is identical to B, B is identical to C, it doesn't follow that A is identical to C. That's what I mean by non-transitive. And if it is transitive, somehow the substitution of terms fails. So anyway, I'm just saying to immediately respond and say, well, I know what identity is. It's this standard relation that we get taught in standard intro logic, and just say, and so you're talking nonsense. This is just completely naive. But and it arises from mixed up views of logic. So anyway, you asked what are some of the problems. I've identified two. One is this Van and Wagon one, and the other is the Trinity, which I don't think motivates gluts or gaps or anything, but it's another one where it's a little bit more knowledge of logic and the philosophy of logic is useful.
So let's stick with the Van and Wagon one. But now let's take a step back. And so your approach essentially is going to come to accepting the contradiction and taking and looking at alternative logics to classical logic, such that that contradiction is not going to mean every arbitrary thing follows. And we can get to that. But I kind of want to start a little bit from the basics and ask you to talk a little bit about what consequence is, what entailment is, and what these things have to do with our understanding of some given theory.
Yeah, good, great. So the term logic is used in lots of different ways. And as far as I'm concerned, people can use it like any term, however they want, as long as they're clear about what they're doing. Quite some time ago at this point, Greg Restall, Greg's a philosopher at Melbourne University, and Greg and I wrote this book called Logical Pluralism. And
I actually interviewed him on this podcast specifically about that book.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, don't interview me about it because we might give different answers. But anyway, I'll have to look at that. So Greg and I wrote this book, and basically one thing, the sort of main thing we were saying there is a sort of what I think of as a fairly modest thesis, which is that given a language, and let's assume that logical throughout our discussion today, let's just assume that logical vocabulary is standard first order vocabulary without identity. So for readers for listeners or viewers not completely on board with what that means, you have logic provides two unary connectives. These are things that take a sentence, exactly one sentence, and make a new sentence. That's why they're called unary. They take one thing and give you a new sentence. Two binary connectives. They take two sentences and make a new sentence. And then they have two quantifiers. So the unary connectives are just, it is true that, it is false that. The falsity connective is usually called logical negation, and the truth operator is usually ignored because it's logically redundant. So it just, the sort of meaning or semantics for it is it's true that P is going to be true just when P is true. It's going to be false just when P is false. So the truth operator isn't doing a whole lot. So it's often ignored, but these things come in pairs. So there's the truth and falsity operator that logic provides. Then there's what's called conjunction and disjunction. And then there's everything and at least one thing. Those are the logical quantifiers. Okay, so let's just assume that when I talk about logical vocabulary, that's all we're talking about. There are debates about where that line is drawn and how to draw it. Depending on what we talk about today and how far we go, I may say something, a little something more about the logical vocabulary. But Greg and I wrote this book where we advance what I take to be a modest thesis, which is that given any natural language and that stock of logical vocabulary, there are many relations of logical consequence on a given language. So you don't have to switch language to get a new relation of logical consequence. Throughout, we were thinking of logical consequence as an absence of counterexample relation. So A is a logical consequence of B if and only if there's no logical possibility in which B is true but A fails to be true. Okay? And we just said, given a natural language and given that stock of vocabulary, there are many relations of logical consequence, logical entailment relations. Notice that there are nobody denies or rejects that there are many entailment relations on language, right? So, for example, that you've got headphones on your ears entails that you've got something on your ears, right? Well, actually, that's a bad example. So scratch that. That you've got headphones on your ears entails that you've got ear helping or supposedly helping or whatever devices on your ears. Okay. That's an entailment, but of course it's not logical entailment because there's no logical vocabulary happening in you've got headphones on your ears, you've got ear helping things on your ears.
Okay, so entailment is just this idea that something follows from something else necessarily, but that doesn't have to be logically. It could be for any other reasons.
This is very important. So that's why I wanted to pause on this for a moment. That's well said. Yeah. So think of entailment as absence of counterexample, as you say, some possibility in which, say, the one sentence or set of sentences is true and the conclusion or whatever is untrue. That's a counterexample. So an entailment relation on a language is just an absence of counterexample relation. There are many. There's a huge plurality of entailment relations on any natural language. But to be logical entailment is to be an entailment relation in virtue of logical vocabulary. So that small stock of vocabulary that we talked about. Okay. Greg and I put forward this book, Logical Pluralism, where we say there are lots of logical entailment relations given a language. And that's all well and true. The trouble is to be a logical, not trouble, but it's worth flagging that position is compatible with a monism about logical consequence that's dictated by a particular role that the relation is supposed to play. Okay? So you could have a bunch of logical entailment relations on a given language, and I think we have many. But if we say we want to talk about logic as whatever satisfies a particular role in the language. That may dictate a monism about logic. And that monism, I say, is compatible with the pluralism that Greg and I talked about. That brings us to what you were asking about, which is how logic might play a part in theories and so on.
Now,
Okay.
when you say you might have a monism because of a certain role, are you thinking of a specific role, or are you just saying given any role you might have a sort of monism within the context of that role?
I think I'm saying both. I mean, in the abstract, you could select a role that demands only if it demands a unique satisfier or a unique realizer of the role, a unique player that's going to play that role. So, in sort of abstractly, right? There's a plurality of people, right? I mean, you're there, I'm here. There's probably people just yonder from you and from me and so on, right? Okay. So there's a plurality of people. But let's say, we want to talk about the role of hosting Who Shaves the Barber, right? That's going to narrow things down to whoever plays that role, and it's going to be a unique realizer. Okay. So if you look at the history of philosophy and science in general, the term logic is often used in various ways. One way is for a theory of good reasoning, or as Harman calls it, change in view or change in acceptance rejection behavior. This is highly complicated. And as Gilbert Harman pointed out in the 80s, that should be clearly distinguished from a theory of logical consequence as a theory of entailment. What Greg and I were talking about was a theory of entailment. We didn't have much to offer on a change in view, a theory of change in view, or change of acceptance rejection behavior. Now, as I said, we talked about a plurality of logical consequence given a language, but here's an important role that you'll see throughout the history of philosophy and its use of the term logic. People say that logic is it's a what's sometimes called a closure relation on theories. What they mean is think of theories as involving two things. You have an initial stock of truths, okay, and then you and these are things. So if we want to give a theory of podcasts, okay, our job is twofold. We first want to come up with, we've identified the phenomenon, podcasts, and now we want to fill the theory with a bunch of truths about that. That's hard work, but we get that. But then there's more hard work. The second thing we have to do is we have to construct a consequence relation or a closure relation for the theory. We want the theory not only to be true, but we want the theory to be as complete as it possibly can. And that's what a consequence relation does. It says, right, you got all these truths. Well, this stuff also then is true. And it just sort of closes the theory to makes it as complete as possible. So if you're giving
when you say complete, do you mean complete with regard to necessary truths?
No, I mean, so for example, if we're giving so let's take logical entailment as our closure or completeness. It's a very, very easy example. So suppose that you and I think it's true that every podcast is fun. Okay, so we're giving this theory of podcasts, and we've got this vocabulary, fun, and all that, and our closure relation for the theory might have something to say about what follows from something's being fun and all that. But you and I have in the theory the truth that every podcast is fun. Logic now takes that and spells out all the logical consequences, right? So podcast 1 is fun, podcast 2 is fun, podcast 3. It just churns out these consequences and completes the theory in that way. Notice that podcast 1 is fun is not a necessary truth. But given the truth that every podcast is fun, our true and complete as possible theory will have that truth in it, that podcast 1 is fun too, and so on. Okay, now logic alone is just one sort of closure relation for our theories. But the role I wanted to highlight is that you can think of logic as the universal basement level closure relation for all of our true and complete as possible theories. So think of a theory of knowledge, right? Again, every theorist has two tasks. First, you want to identify the phenomenon, so the sort of maybe what's known and so on. And we're going to have, for this theory, we're going to have the target vocabulary, like the knowledge operator. It is known that. Notice that logic says nothing about that operator that it doesn't say about everything, right? It basically just treats that as a dummy operator, because all it cares about are it's false that it's true that either this or that, both this and that, for all and some, right? That's all logic cares about. So when it sees it is known that, that's to logic, that's just, like it's funny that, or logic's just, that's nice and well, okay. But notice, if we're giving the true theory of knowledge, we want that operator to have certain entailments. So we have to construct, after we put our truths in there in the theory, we have to construct the extra logical consequence relation to make sure that the theory has, from it is known that P, you get it's true that P. Okay. If for philosophical reasons you reject that, fine, pick some other example. But let's suppose that that's right. Then our true theory has to have that entailment going on, right? Logic won't provide it, so you've got to build it. But you don't have to build logic, because sort of that's where you start. So as a theorist, you want to throw the truths into the theory, and 2, you want to then construct the extra logical consequence or closure relation for the theory. You do that on top of logic. So when I talk about the role of being the universal basement level closure operator, that's the one that we as theorists don't have to worry much about. That's just assumed, okay? And that's the role that logic plays when, or that's the role that I care about in this stuff we're talking about. So there are many relations of logical consequence on the language, but when we identify that role of being the basement level universal closure relation, that narrows down to one particular role. And now it matters, right, whether logic's going to allow for the possibility of a glut, whether it's going to allow for the possibility of a gap, whether it's going to allow for a classically closed true theory, because logic's going to be universal. It's going to be in every true theory. And so if logic doesn't allow gluts, then we're going to have, absurdity following from this contradictory theory of Christ and all this stuff. I mean, you may not care about that, but if logic doesn't allow gluts and gaps, then there are a whole lot of viable candidates for true theories that are simply ruled out.
So you're talking then about logic being, in a way, a sort of the minimum kinds of rules that any kind of theory is going to have to follow, right?
That's right.
Any other theory might sort of put any extra rules on them, but these are the sort of minimum bottom level kinds of rules that any theory is going to have to follow.
That's right. Can I just say one thing, follow up on that?
Yeah.
And you can then think about the logical vocabulary. We've sort of stipulated a basic stock of law. But you can think of the logical vocabulary as the vocabulary that appears in all of these true and complete as possible theories. So that's why, necessity, this kind of stuff isn't going to be, that's not in all theories. It's not in physics. It's not in arithmetic or whatever. But that's because these are extra logical things that are peculiar to the theory. Okay.
So now, about this sort of universal base level kind of logic, are you a pluralist about that?
No.
No. Okay, no. Good. That's what I wanted to clarify. Okay.
Although so then, Greg, when I was in Melbourne, Greg said, you see, I think you're not really a pluralist at all. And he said, after all the book and everything else, he said, because you're a monist about the basement level closure relation involved in all true theories, he said that you're not truly a logical pluralist of the Beall-Restall variety. But
that's funny. That was
He's just completely wrong, by the way. I think the Beall-Restall pluralism should be understood as defined in the papers and book that we did, and I think it's completely compatible. I think that Greg is a much more radical pluralist than I am.
Interesting.
Yeah. Anyway.
It was a thought that I had when I read your paper, where you seem to be kind of putting forward FDE, and we'll talk in a minute about what that is, as a kind of basement level relation. I was like, wait a minute, so are you not a pluralist? So now I now I understand what you mean.
You're not alone. Greg thinks I'm not, and there's another philosopher logician at Melbourne, Sean Standifer, who agrees with Greg that. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, so can you now kind of give your account of what that basement relation, should be, and why?
Yeah. So I think that I think it's pretty clear that if there is a true Christian, standard Christian theory, then it's one where you're either going to have some gluts or you're going to have some gaps. So if there is a true one, I think anyone pursuing that phenomenon, ought to reject that the logical consequence relation that plays the role of universal closure. I think they should reject that it's classical. I think that they should think that it's subclassical, that is, weaker than classical logic. But even if you had zero interest in that project, I think that there are other phenomena that suggest that some of our candidates for the true theory of the given phenomenon are glutty or gappy. I mean, clearly some of the standard paradoxes and stuff, a liar, I'm false. I mean, this just screams out as being a glut. I mean, it's false, right? So it's true. Okay, so it's true and false. Oh, hold on, and then, I mean, so that's one thing. Some people point to like a truth teller, which says I'm true. Okay, well, it doesn't. If it's true, then it's true. If it's false, then it's false. Yeah, but anyway, it just sort of looks like it's neither. Not because of inconsistency, but because of there's not enough sort of pushing one way or the other. Or there's so many phenomena that sort of, especially in the paradox sort of realm, that scream out for this abnormal treatment. So I think, there are two common subclassical logics. One's called strong-Kleene, sometimes abbreviated K3. One is called Logic of Paradox by Graham Priest, the most famous advocate for it. And it was called Logic of, the propositional bit was called Calculus for Antinomies by Florencio Asenjo. And both of them are concerned with sort of paradoxes and stuff. But those are two. So if you look at the literature on subclassical logic, so Hartree Field and I are both transparent truth theorists. Hartree takes a K3 in his book, Saving Truth. I take LP, as I said at the start, in my Spandrels of Truth. Graham takes, although Graham's not a transparent truth theorist, he takes LP for truth theory and stuff, all in response to paradoxes. And of course, there are many, many other theorists in the subclassical realm. But notice, here's an independent argument, apart from whether you're interested in the true standard theory of Christianity, the Christian view of the world with these apparently contradictory Christ figure and this stuff, or paradox or whatever. Here's an independent picture. Motivation. Just think of your picture of logic as universal closure, right? How is it natural to think that logic, as this universal, topic neutral sort of closure relation, it rules out gluts, but of course it recognizes many gappy possibilities? That would be the K3 picture. I mean, it just seems weird. Like, logic says, oh, of course there can be many, many cases where P is neither true nor false. So logic's operators, it is true the P, it is false the P. Sure, you can have many possibilities in which neither of those claims obtain. Sure. But never can you have it where both of them obtain. This just seems like a really imbalanced picture of logic. Now take the LP case, where you've got logic saying, right, so logic's truth operator, logic's falsity operator. Sure, there are many possibilities in which both of those claims obtain, but no, there couldn't possibly be one in which neither of them do. I mean, this just seems like you're sort of squeezing yourself to one side or squeezing yourself to the other in your picture of the universal topic neutral relation. Okay, so a more balanced approach is called for. And this is a very well explored account, which is called FDE. Well explored in the 60s and 70s by Mike Dunn, J. Michael Dunn, and Newell Belknap. It's called FDE for first degree entailment. And they were interested in what's called relevance logic. I'm setting all that stuff aside. It's very interesting, but I don't I don't think that relevance considerations motivate anything when you're thinking about the role of universal closure. I just don't think it's relevant. So FDE is the sort of more symmetric picture where your logic allows for both cases where it is true that P and it is false that P. Both of them obtain. There are possibilities where they obtain, and there are possibilities where they fail. So you have this balance picture. The important thing is logic on this account recognizes those possibilities, but it also recognizes perfectly classical possibilities where you don't have gluts or gaps at all. So the way I think of it is the argument for FDE, an argument, is this. If we're going to think of the role of logic as playing this universal closure, given the naturalness of a glutty-gappy account of certain phenomena, we certainly ought to be subclassical with respect to the universal closure relation. But if we're going to be subclassical, then we want to be balanced, right? We're not just technicians. We're philosophers trying to give the best overall account. And one important thing is we lose absolutely no true classically closed theories if we go subclassical. So if you say logic is classical, the relation playing that role is classical, we lose no true theories from your perspective. But if we go subclassical, we get to enjoy many other possibly true theories. In particular, these ones that are of weird phenomena that may be glutty, or weird phenomena that may be gappy. So we lose nothing, but we gain something, and something possibly important. So that's why I think, both the K3 and LP picture could say that too, and have historically, but then that's where both of those are sort of lopsided. So that's why I think you're eventually pushed to FDE. Simple argument, you lose no classically closed theories, true theories. And second, it's a more balanced picture than standard accounts of the universal closure relation, subclassical, LP, K3. So, as I said, FDE recognizes all classical possibilities, but it says there are more that logic recognizes. There are the glutty ones and there are the gappy ones. So if the truth of, say, arithmetic is one which is completely classical, so the closure is completely classical, that's perfectly compatible with logic being FDE. What's happening there? What's happening is when you construct your extra logical closure relation, you have to add as theoretical impossibilities gluts. You say they're theoretically impossible. So the closure relation on those recognizes no glutty possibilities, and likewise for gaps.
So here's what I think is the most intuitive and sort of simple objection to this picture, particularly to the glutty part of this picture, which is just that it's part of the meaning of truth and falsity that they be incompatible, that they be complementary. And so while there is something intuitive about this kind of symmetric account and this kind of, allow as many possibilities as possible for this sort of bottom level account, that there's something incoherent or just wrong about it, because the very meaning of truth and falsity are actually part of what they mean is that they can't be together. How do you respond to somebody who feels that way?
So I think that's a great question, or objection. So there are two things. When we talk about truth and falsity, either we're talking about logic's own truth and falsity operators. It's true that P, it's false that P. That is logical negation, and it's and the sort of null operator or redundant truth operator. And here, what's the meaning? Well, I mean, the truth operator is just identity, right? So it's the truth conditions and falsity conditions for that is just, it's true that P is true in the possibility, if and only if P is true in that possibility or obtains there. It's true that P is false in a possibility, if and only if P is false in that possibility. Those are just the fundamental truth and falsity conditions for the truth operator. Now, the falsity operator, logical negation. It's false that P, that's true in a possibility, if and only if P is false in that possibility. It's false that P is false in a possibility, if and only if P is true in that possibility. Now, if you write those down, you'll notice that neither one rules out gluts or gaps. So those are the simple truth and falsity conditions for, let's focus on the falsity operator, right? It's false that P, that's going to be true in a possibility, if and only if P is false in that possibility. It's false that P, that's going to be false in a possibility, if and only if P is true in that possibility. Those are the truth and falsity conditions. No classical logician, no whatever are going to reject that. But they don't rule out gluts at all. How do you rule out gluts? You have to ad hocly say, and in addition, no possibility allows for P's being true and false there. But where do you get that? You have to add that on. The truth and falsity conditions don't rule that out. They don't rule it in, they don't rule it out. You said, yeah, but the meaning of truth and falsity rule that out. Well, if we're talking, when we say truth and falsity, if we mean the logic's falsity operator, and if by meaning of that we just mean the truth and falsity conditions, truth in a possibility, falsity in a possibility, where's that ruled out? It's not. You have to rule it out. So then the objection is just, well, I rule out those possibilities, hence the meaning does. That doesn't seem like a very, persuasive objection. You might, though, one giving this objection, you might be thinking not about logic's truth and falsity operators, but truth and falsity predicates. These are very different things. And, theories of the nature of truth and stuff have different answers on what those properties are. But none of them ultimately, you have to ad hocly sort of say that you can't have a sentence that's both true and false. I mean, you have to impose that. There's, as far as I can see, there's nothing sort of in the very meaning of these things that rules them out. I think people say that because so very, 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 very many of our true closed theories are classical. They're just classically closed. And so people just think, because there are so many, in my opinion, the majority of true theories are classically closed. But people step from that to the idea that all of them are. And I just think maybe so, but I think that certainly logic doesn't demand it.
It seems to me that a good reason to take FDE as this sort of basement level relation, as you've proposed, is that it is so weak, and yet we can still sort of make sense of everything that it's sort of proposing, that even if no one theory's closure was that weak, the space of possibilities should be that weak just by virtue of the fact that we sort of can actually construct a logical theory that is that weak. That whatever we're calling the bottom level space of possibilities should be as weak as we can actually basically make it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I want to resist that a little bit, though I think I wish I had a better sort of argument against that sort of position. So, I mean, if we extend what you're just saying now, then we get to things like the empty logic. So there's a philosopher, logician Rowan French, in Melbourne, and he advocates that logic isn't even reflexive. So P doesn't even logically entail P. He thinks, so he agrees with me that many of our theories have these very strong closure relations, classical, say. But he thinks that these are all part of our job as theorists to impose theory-specific extra-logical conditions. So he really gives a picture where logic is just completely empty and everything is theory. Okay, so that would be the sort of natural slide from what you're saying. It should be as weak as possible to accommodate as many theoretical possibilities, and then leave it to the job of the theorist to roll those out. I certainly see the force of that, and that's in keeping with the argument I gave, which is, look, you lose no classically closed true theories, and you gain some important non-classical ones. If logic is as weak as you want, and Rowan would sort of join you, that's in perfect keeping with that argument for going subclassical. Here's where I get off the train, so to speak. I think that just as this universal closure rule has been very, very salient in the history of philosophy and science when we talk about sort of logic versus sort of extra logical consequence stuff in the theory-specific consequence. I think some other things are pretty clear too. That, for example, that logic has properties that deliver, what are technically called closure or consequence operators. We don't need to go into that, but importantly, that logic is reflexive, transitive, that it has these, and that it has this sort of monotonicity. That is, if A logically implies B, logically entails B. That's what I mean by implies in that context. If A logically entails B, then so too for any sentence or proposition C together with A logically entails B. You can't sort of ruin a logically valid argument by adding premises. That's the sort of monotonicity. these features, I think, have been very salient in tradition, and I see no reason to sort of give those up. I'm open to it for just the reasons that you and Rowan are pointing to, but I just see no reason to keep going on the train. But I'm happy to sort of stop and wave goodbye to you guys as you go off the cliff. But I think your question is really important in the context of logic playing this universal role. That the strength of classical sort of closure properties are explained by theory-specific extra-logical. So I get it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is, in part, do you want your logic to be, to have its role being able to describe closure in different kinds of theories and different kind of phenomena, or are you simply looking to describe the widest possible space of possibility? Because in a sense, if we're just looking to be able to account for a phenomena, you may not need anything weaker than FDE because, let's say, all the paradoxes can sort of be handled with either gaps or gluts. The question might be, well, do you still have a reason simply, again, just as a matter of exploring the space of theoretical, I don't even want to say theoretical possibility, but just, possibility in its most abstract sense that may not be even instantiated by any phenomena, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the question, is how weak do you go? So I take a stand that I'm after. So I still think there are many logical consequence relations given a language, but when we've identified this role of universal closure, I am taking a stand on particular properties that relation is going to have. And these are, we don't, I mean, I mentioned them. So if a consequence relation has the sort of three properties I was talking about in the right way, reflexivity, transitivity, and a sort of monotonicity, these give rise to what are standardly called closure operators for theories. So you take the consequence relation and it immediately delivers a sort of closure relation. It's not, we don't need to go into the details, but I just bring that up to say that Rowan is not even on that track. So in the position you're advocating, where you want it to be as weak as you can, isn't on that track. Unless what you're saying is as weak as you can, compatible with having these standard closure properties. If that's what you're saying, then that's different from what Rowan's saying, and you are indeed still on the track, and you might find yourself in FDE territory. Mm-hmm. Well, you will. Well, at least if we're assuming certain things about the logical vocabulary and their truth and falsity conditions and stuff. But there's something even, there are weaker subclassical relations that are still induced closure operators. So even on the track that I'm on, and I think maybe now that I understand your question a bit more, I think you're on too, which is as weak as you can, compatible with this closure property role understood in a standard way. You can be weaker than FDE, and there's a good question whether you should be. I just sort of landed FDE because it's I think it's good, but I'm completely open to going a little bit weaker, compatible with the standard closure properties. So sorry if I misunderstood earlier, but it's worth pointing out that Rowan and other people like well, there's a whole flurry of activity in what's called substructural logic, and all of these sort of are on a different track. Like, they're not talking about consequence relation in the sense that induces the standard closure properties. But yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for walking me through some of that. I think you were saying maybe you misunderstood me, and I think actually I'm not really sort of settled in this area, and also I don't. There's a lot that I don't know in this area, so it's stuff that I'm still exploring. So that's actually quite a few avenues for me to explore. I'll have to check out Rowan. I wasn't familiar with him, so
yeah, he's got a paper in Philosopher's Imprint, I think, and that's a good one to look at. He has a bunch of philosophical remarks at the end. There's a bunch of sort of technical stuff at the beginning, but and he may have written stuff since then, but that would be a good place for you to look in that direction, especially as compared with the program I'm talking about. Which, by the way, all the logic stuff that we're talking about is sort of independent of the theology, but it's the big background picture of logic's role. And now you can see, take theology as just another theory. So you have the task, if you think this is a true theory, you want to get the truths together. That's what the councils have done, and now you want to get the right consequence relation. And it looks like you'd better think that logic is, or at least you should be open to it, that logic is FD-ish or something. But the logic stuff that we've been talking about, apart from all the theology application, that's what's in this undetached book, Logic from a Subclassical Point of View. So it just sort of advocates this simple FD picture as universal closure, and then talks about a lot of the stuff that we were talking about.
So I'd like to ask you just one more question. So we went on a very deep rabbit hole into the logic stuff.
Sorry about that.
No, which is great. I really enjoyed it. I want to just bring it back to the theology for one last question. And I mean, I think, how all of this answers the fundamental problem that you brought up by Wagon is fairly clear, right? Now we have a logic where that contradiction isn't going to entail everything, and we can take a kind of simple answer where we don't have to do big conceptual interpretation about immutability and divinity. We can just accept, it really is both immutable and not mutable, and let's just accept that. Yep. I guess the question I wanted to ask you is, I would think, so I'm not a Christian myself, but I would think that for many people who deal somewhat with the philosophical and metaphysical sort of issues behind their theology, this might still seem a bit like going too far into a kind of technical realm, and in a way that would seem to be moving away from what faith and having a kind of relationship to the faith is. What do you think, not speaking so strictly logically, what do you think is the real relevance of this for somebody as an actual Christian?
Okay, great question. Remember that there are lots of varieties of Christianity, just like there are lots of varieties of every position. It doesn't have to be religious, right? I mean, whatever, every philosophical, whatever position, there are lots of varieties. So we were careful at the start to say, let's stipulate that when we talk about standard, Christian theology or thought, we just mean this Chalcedon, this particular understanding of Chalcedon-constrained Christian theory. But of course, there are many Christians who, they're particularly concerned with the practice of Christianity, and the sort of theory to them is not important. So there's that sort of crowd. And look, I mean, that's one way of, I mean, I think people should live life however they choose to do it. It's very short, and try to do it the best you can. So I don't have a lot to say to people who think that there's no true theory behind this, and it's all just sort of practice and all that. But for those who think that there is a true theory, so when they talk about Christianity and Christian theology, they mean to be speaking about a true theory about reality. They don't mean to be speaking about a fiction or just a guide to make us sort of breathe better or act together better or anything like that. It's a theory in the way that, the theory of gravity or theory of whatever. These are all purport to be true and as complete as possible accounts of the target phenomenon. So for those people who take Christianity to be a true theory of the world, I think that you're right. They haven't often thought hard enough. Well, let me not say that. Let me just say, I think that there's a burden on theorists, theologians, as theorists of the God phenomenon and all that part of reality, to understand that logic plays a central role at the bottom of that theory, and that just because this is a theological phenomenon, that doesn't absolve anyone from the responsibility to be clear about the entailments involved in the theory, any more than if you're doing arithmetic. You can't just say, well, we don't have to be clear about the entailment relation or whatever. No, of course you do. So what does this have to do with the practicing, Christian? Well, if they think that there's a true theory, they have a task as a theorist to at least be aware of this. That's one answer. The other answer is, even so, you might be asking about, is there any practical sort of thing that falls out of this? And that's something that, so I'll be spending next year at Notre Dame doing a project on this, a book-length project. And that's, together with working out many more details, we've only talked about it a teeny bit, but that's a question. Like, is there a practical side of the glut theory or the gap theory to, like, and I don't know, but let me gesture at one as a way to answer this final question. And I'm really, by the way, I want to say that I want to talk with a lot of sort of practicing Christians and sophisticated theologians about this. I don't, this isn't said with a lot of confidence, but there's a hope that there's a practical side. And it's just this. So you might think that sometimes Christians need to rely on the absolute divinity, divine perfection of Christ, this central Messiah figure in the whole theory, right? They need to rely on this, on the divinity, the truth that Christ is divine. But of course, none of these Christians are divine, right? And when they're sort of struggling and suffering and so on, they need to know that this figure really understands what they're going through, right? This is a common thing that you hear from Christians, that it's good to know that, Christ understands my suffering and all that. But if this is more than just sort of metaphor or chanting or something, presumably in some of those contexts, what they really need, what they're getting benefit from, is the falsity of Christ's divinity. It's false that Christ is divine. They're focused on the truth of Christ's humanity and the falsity. Because if you're thinking, oh yeah, this divine entity completely understands what I'm going through, I can't imagine sort of getting any sort of comfort from that. But if you're focused on it's false that Christ is divine and true that Christ is human, there you could get comfort. And then when you need to know that this entity can do anything, right, then you can focus on the truth of the divinity and the falsity of the humanity. So you ask, is there any practical benefit? Because any sort of practicing Christian is going to say, oh, this is just way too, you're getting away from the heart of Christianity. Okay, I don't say this with a lot of confidence, but I do want to say I'm optimistic that it's quite the contrary, that this contradiction is at the center of Christianity, both in theory and practice. And in particular, it is the contradiction against which all heresies have been defined and all deviations. And anyway, so I don't know. I think it's I think it could be really. I've enjoyed the project so far. I've put it on hold because I had to do this other purely logic and philosophy of logic thing that we've been talking about. But I think that there may be some practical benefits, but I don't know. I think there's certainly theoretical benefit, but whether there will be any sort of practice that follows, I just don't know. Yeah,
it's a really interesting argument. I think it was in your paper as well. But the idea that in order for Christ to understand our suffering, he needs to actually be limited like we are. Like you can't understand that kind of limitation without having it. And so he actually has to be limited even at the same time as not being limited.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, that's how I'm thinking of it too. It seems like this contradiction is just central to, I mean, not only is it clearly central to the statement of the theory, but as you reminded me, it looks central to the practice. Like and you put it nicely. Yeah, it's like how can you find comfort in the fact that, well, sure, this God suffered. Well, I don't. I mean, I have to know that suffered in a way the way I suffered, to really know that somebody understands, something. I mean, that's the thought anyhow. And there you need the falsity of divinity. You need the limitation of humanity. And I'm not an expert, but every time I've talked with people who are, and I look forward to Notre Dame next year to talk with more, but every time I've talked with people about this, people find it very, very plausible that you have to, as you said, that this figure needs to be limited in the way that I am. But if the figure is God, it can't be. So again, the contradiction, you find all these different ways of thinking about, well, limited but, or understanding, or you do all this sort of conceptual juggling, as you put it earlier, like really sophisticated conceptual maneuvering to get around this basic contradiction. And yet, it looks like the contradiction is central. So, Christians have for a long, long time said that the Christian theory of the world is very, very radical. And if you think in terms of sort of, that there'd be this sort of entity that's God and human, not in diminished ways, but completely has these two. That is radical because it's just a contradiction. And your whole story is this thing sort of walked around the world and all this stuff. So even though I've been very, very conservative in my own work about gluts, so I tend to think, like in the Spandrels of Truth, I just say, yeah, it's just these spandrels of the truth predicate stuff that are glutty. Just this would be something. I mean, radical is an understatement. This would be the sort of walking contradiction in reality. So, but anyway, yeah. That's
awesome. Well, JC, thank you so much. This has been a really great discussion. I really appreciate it.
Oh, good, William. I'm sorry. There was sort of so much background on the logic and philosophy of logic, and then we were trying to. But I hope it was valuable. I certainly enjoyed it, and I think that, as I said earlier, I think that your podcast series is a valuable thing. So I'm glad you're doing it.
I appreciate it. And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.